Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com.
The educational ministry of Bethany Lutheran Church of Kerman, California supports this podcast through co-host Pastor Greg Camp. Church services are available on Zoom at www.bethanykerman.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Scriptural Works. I'm one of the co-hosts, Patrick Spencer, and Greg Camp, my other co-host, is joining me. Greg, always great to see you.
Good morning, Patrick. Yeah, it's great to be here this morning.
Well, we have a real treat because we're kicking off a series on the Johannine Epistles. For those of us who study Greek, I think that was the first New Testament text that I translated anyway. I don't know about Greg, probably.
No, it was.
And
we're starting at verse 5.
We're joined today by Warren Carter. Warren, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate you making time to speak with us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, anyone who's read all of Warren's work knows that he is prolific in terms of the amount of content that he publishes, both in the peer-reviewed articles as well as books. And I think if AI is right, Warren, you're up to 17 books now?
Something like that, yes, I think so.
Soon to be 20? Probably. Well, I'll do a quick intro here for Dr. Warren Carter. He is a New Testament exegete from, as you could probably tell from his accent, from New Zealand. One of the most, as I noted, prolific voices in imperial, critical, and rhetorical readings of the New Testament. If you have read, I'm sure some in our audience have. If you haven't, check out his books. In fact, we're going to advertise one that he has written on 1st and 2nd and 3rd John here in a moment, and you can it'll be a link at the bottom of the podcast as well. He completed his PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Testament. He previously did degrees at Victoria University in Wellington, Melbourne College of Divinity over in the UK, or UK in Australia. I'll get it right yet. Wrong side of the pond. He is the LaDonna Kramer Minders Professor of New Testament at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He previously taught at Bright Divinity School. I spent time in that library working on term papers sometimes when we drive over to Fort Worth. St. Paul Theological School of Theology. He's an ordained New Zealand Baptist minister who associates with the Disciples of Christ. He's active in both scholarly and church context. As I noted, he's an author of over 17 books and counting. He's written extensively on Matthew, includes a book called Matthew in the Margins. It's a great book. If you don't have it, it's one to put in your library. Matthew and Empire, John and Empire, and the Roman Empire and the New Testament. He's focused in the last couple of years, he's written a book, as I noted, he's focused on the Johannine Epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, an introduction and study guide. It's a very, very readable book. It's about 120, 30 pages if you don't count the bibliography. For anyone who's wanting to teach or preach on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, this is a must-have in your library. And as I said, it's very accessible. I actually read it while I was working out on the exercise bike, and I learned a lot in the process. So, Warren, we really appreciate you making time. Before we do so, Greg, I'll let you kick it off, but I'll do a quick ad from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So, Greg, I'll let you kick off the discussion with Warren.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here, Warren. And it's been a long time since we were together in person. We're blessed to have Warren out in Fresno to give some lectures to our freshmen, because his work has built so much on the Gospel of Matthew and Empire, and that's what we had our freshmen going through. And so I got to know your work through your imperial, critical, and rhetorical readings, which I've always turned back to for, particularly for my work on Matthew, but you've now extended that to the Gospel of John and just to the broader Roman Empire to help people understand that context. But the Johannine Epistles is a far step from that, it would seem. What took you over to these Johannine Epistles, and how does your methodological toolkit help us understand 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John?
Well, thanks for having me. There's a very pragmatic answer to that question, and then there's something that's just a little more erudite. But the pragmatic answer is I was invited. So the editor of the series asked me if I would do this volume on 1, 2, and 3 John. As you mentioned, I've done some previous work on John's Gospel and reading the Gospel in relation to the Roman Empire, for example. But I hadn't done work on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. But it was in this series, this T&T Clark Study Guide series, which I think is a very good study for very good series for folks who want to begin to engage any of the biblical texts, useful for preaching, for study, whatever. So I was happy to contribute to that particular series. So that's the sort of the pragmatic answer. The longer answer is that several years ago I was doing some preparation for presentation in a church, and as part of that presentation I was looking at some material in 1st John, and found myself being kind of intrigued by a number of aspects. Again, I mean, I hadn't worked on it much in the past, a little bit, but noticing some really interesting things around the rhetoric, around the claims, and we'll talk about this, the claims of the schism or the division in 1 John chapter 2. The structure of this writing is always intriguing. And so I sort of kind of registered these thoughts, but put them on the back burner because I was working on other things. But I thought, that'd be interesting to come back to someday. So the invitation to work on it connected to those sorts of concerns. The other piece is that, as you mentioned, I've been reading New Testament texts in relation to the Roman Empire. I've done it with Matthew and with Mark. I've done a book on Revelation. And so I've made the claim a number of times in a number of places that all the New Testament texts engage the Roman Empire in various ways, that it's the context for the Jesus movement, it's the context for all of these writings. Of course, some folks don't find that at all convincing, and they think the New Testament has nothing to do with the Roman Empire, which kind of strikes me as rather strange when the main character gets crucified on a Roman cross.
Yeah.
I would have thought that was fairly convincing. But I wondered, how that claim would work out in relation to these writings. So that was sort of another incentive for exploring them and responding to the invitation.
Yeah.
Great.
No, I was going to say that's great because it does connect in different ways than say Matthew and Mark and Luke and the others do. But I think what you've brought in terms of the rhetoric and some of the broader cultural background is really helpful, which is again why we are suggesting this particular book, because you bring those to the forefront for us.
Yeah, it's a great introduction to the subject. Now, for those of us who've done a little dabbling in the Johannine community and maybe just the Gospel of John, some of us done more studies in the epistles as well. There's this paradigm. Brown and Martin really have been the primary proponents of it over the last, I guess, when was initial writings, probably back in the 60s. So it's been around for about 40 years in terms of its current form. But this concept of a community crisis that stands behind the writing of the Gospel of John, as well as the three epistles, Warren, and that they're sort of intertwined and tied together. You challenge this community crisis model, if you may, or however you want to describe it. What's the problem that you see with this crisis? Maybe provide a brief introduction for audience who aren't familiar with it, with how they frame this community crisis model, but then what's your critique of it?
Yeah, well, that's a big topic. So we'll divide it into bits and pause for a breath in the middle somewhere. First of all, let me explain what this model is, usually associated with Raymond Brown, very famous New Testament scholar. As you say, basically worked out, constructed and argued from about 1980. I've got his book here, The Community of the Beloved Disciple, Life, Loves and Hates of an Individual Church, which was actually published in 1979. So this has been around, around 45 or so years now. and it's really held sway, I think, in interpretations of these writings for a very long time. So what's Brown doing? In any conversation about these letters, I think has to start with Brown's work. So what's he doing? Let me explain first of all. Well, first of all, he sees these 4 texts in the name of John lined up. So we've got the Gospel, we've got 1 John, we've got 2 John, we've got 3 John. And he takes that order very seriously. But there's a big disruption to it, and he focuses in on 1 John and chapter 2, verse 19, and we've got this reference to a division or a schism, a conflict, a fight that has gone on, he says, in the Johannine community. And he sees all of this as sort of lining out one individual church, as he calls it, one community. And in chapter 2, verse 19, he focuses in on this reference. Some folks have gone out from us. They did not belong to us. If they belonged to us, they wouldn't have gone out from us. And so he sees this as a central conflict, a central schism in the community. He calls them, the writer or writers of 1 John call them antichrists, calls them liars, calls them deceivers, aligns them with the devil. So there's a bit of heat here in terms of who these folks are. They're not popular, according to at least the writer or writers of the document. They don't affirm Jesus is the Christ. That's one of the things that's said about them. And they don't affirm that Jesus has come in the flesh, which is another thing that's said about them. Now, what Brown does with this is say, okay, so we've got these folks who have gone out. Why have they gone out? Why is there a schism? Who are they? And he argues that they are folks who were part of the Johannine community. They were part of the tradition, but in the view of the writer of 1 John and in Brown's analysis, they have misinterpreted aspects of the gospel. So this is very much an internal shake-up. They have misinterpreted parts of the gospel around 4 big themes. First is Christology, as I've just mentioned. They don't think Jesus is the Christ. They don't think Jesus came in the flesh, which Brown interprets to mean that they sort of got stuck or obsessed with the very beginning of John's gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. So this heavenly divine being is how they've come to understand Jesus and have denied that there was really any incarnation, that he came in the flesh. So that's the sort of the Christological error that 1 John then addresses and tries to correct. The second thread that Brown pulls from this view of misinterpreting the gospel has to do with ethics. And Brown says that they deny that they have sinned. They are now sin-free and perfect. That how they live their lives is of no consequence because they are sin-free. And they've broken the great big commandment, which is to love the brothers and the sisters. Even though, which they've done by leaving the community. They've gone out from us. Third big strand that Brown says they've misinterpreted has to do with the Spirit. So an area of pneumatology, they claim that they are guided now totally, completely and utterly by the Spirit, so they don't sin. The Spirit teaches them all they need to know, so they don't need any other teachers, they don't need the community, they've gone out, etc. And fourth, they have, Brown says, misinterpreted the eschatology of the gospel. They've pressed the gospel's eschatology too far in terms of, claiming sinlessness, claiming this total governance by the Spirit. So as far as they're concerned, the end time has already come. They already live in it. They already have it. And Brown says that, according to 1 John, this, of course, is an error. So we've got 4 big themes developed from the gospel: Christology, ethics, pneumatology, and eschatology, that these folks have misinterpreted. And because of this misinterpretation, there's obviously been fights, there's been conflicts, arguments, bitterness around all of this. They have gone out from the community. That then takes us to 2 John and 3 John, where we have a concern with these folks now as wandering itinerants, folks who are going around churches saying, we have a word from the Lord, we're going to teach in your community, and what are folks supposed to do? And so 2 and 3 John alert readers to the issue here. That's a bit simplistic, but we'll come back to that, I hope. Then Brown says, from after 3rd John, we've got a further development. The orthodox reading of the gospel is that of the main church, the Catholic Church, and the readings of these other folks who have gone out, they devolve into groups like Gnostics and Docetists and Cerinthians, not Corinthians, Cerinthians, and other such groups, splinter groups in the Jesus movement. So that's basically Brown's analysis. We can pause for a breath here, and just to say it's brilliant. I mean, it's a stunning analysis, and it's clearly held clout for 45 years now as the dominant, some would say the only reading of 1, 2, and 3 John. I mean, I was brought up on this. I didn't know there were alternative readings. That this was, the definitive word on 1, 2, and 3 John. All right. So your second part of your question: what's the problem with this? If it's so good and if it's been so convincing, what's the problem? Well, the first point I think that I want to register is that it is an interpretation. It is a construction. It is a way of making sense of, making meaning of these 3 documents and doing the sort of features that I've just mentioned. The reliance on the gospel, the misinterpretation of the gospel, the central aspect of the schism, this conflict, this division, and so forth. That's the sort of the dominant way of doing it. Now, but it is a construction. It's not set in concrete. And so we can think about the construction. Are there other ways of making meaning of this? Brown says at the beginning of his book that if about 60% of this is on target, he's a happy man. Well, pleased to make him happy, but he doesn't say which 60%. And he doesn't say how we are to know which 60% is on target and which 40% isn't. And it's his way of acknowledging, and, due credit here, it's his way of acknowledging that there are a number of assumptions in his analysis. There are a number of things that he's assuming, that he's postulating, that he didn't know for sure, but kind of fit the overall picture, which again underscores that it is a construction. It's a way of making meaning. So beyond that, the big key thing in this analysis is the assumption that the schism, this division, this conflict is central to the whole of the Johannine tradition, the Johannine community. This in chapter 2, verse 19, they've gone out from us. Well, folks in recent times have spent a lot of time and attention on this verse as to what it is actually claiming. Now, we're going to get obsessive for a moment here about pronouns. They have gone out from us. They did not belong to us. Who's the us that's being talked about here? Because, if you read 1 John from the beginning, you'll notice that in chapter 1, we've got a lot of emphasis on we and you language. And they're not the same. We have things to tell you, the audience, and we hope you get on board in the way that we are on board. So when it talks about they've gone out from us, who have they gone out from? Did they go out from the actual recipients? So are the recipients in trauma and crisis, as Brown says? Or did they go out from us, the writers of the document? Now, we don't know who this us or we happen to be. We don't even know how many, except it's plural in Greek. So there are at least 2 of them. Are there 2? Are there 10? Are there 20? Are there 30? We don't know. But there's certainly a separate entity here, the we and you, the recipients. But there's another strange thing about this wording of verse 19 that a number of folks have identified. It's introduced by the little phrase, as you have heard, they have gone out from us. Now, if it was a crisis in the community, we could at least expect minimally, as you have experienced, or as all of us have experienced, if it's a whole community thing. All of us know the pain of this separation, and it hasn't been a good time, has it? We'd expect a little bit more than as you have heard. So the construction that Brown offers of this sort of community crisis, well, it may not be a community crisis. It might have been something that happened to the we group, but not necessarily to the recipients at all. Now, that's a significant way of rethinking chapter 2, verse 19. And as some other folks have said, well, if it's such a big crisis event, why do we only get one reference to it in 2:19? And again, in 2 John, there's another reference in verse 7 to many deceivers are abroad in the world. Well, is that the same thing, or is that a generic statement? But certainly, there are not constant references to the schism if it's to be so central. So folks have also pulled at these four threads that Brown has argued, these four issues that make up the schism: the Christology, the ethics, the pneumatology, the eschatology, and have picked away at the arguments that he has made. So, for example, if at the heart of this is a Christological division, that Jesus has not come in the flesh, if you wanted in 1 John to make a response to this, and Brown argues, 1 John is polemic in attacking these people and discrediting them, then surely there's a bunch of stuff in the gospel that you could appeal to show, look how wrong they were to say Jesus has not come in the flesh. After all, Jesus healed some folks. After all, Jesus fed some folks. After all, Jesus encountered folks all over the place in all sorts of different situations and all sorts of different peoples. Jesus had fights with folks. Jesus spent some time in Galilee. He spent some time in Jerusalem. He spent some time in the temple. He spent some time in villages. I mean, and he died on a cross. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that you could appeal to in the gospel to make an argument against this. If this is sort of the dominant erroneous claim. But of course we don't get that in 1 John. We don't get anything like that. Likewise with the ethics piece, so Brown mirror reads, and that's kind of a big phrase, mirror reads the references to sin and confession of sin and says, well, that's what these folks have gone out of claiming, that they were claiming to be sinless. Well, you can actually reread those statements without assuming opponents and without assuming a schism. That the recognition that human beings sin, that even in the community we sin. You don't have to deny that you have sinned. If you deny, you're in fact deceiving yourself. Sinfulness is simply part of who we are, even if we aspire to something else. And there's a nice pastoral word. Right? If you've sinned and if you confess your sin, God is just and faithful and will forgive your sin and cleanse you from all unrighteousness. How's that for a nice pastoral reassurance? Right. It doesn't have to be a polemical jab.
Right.
And you don't have to assume opponents. You can simply assume this is an issue for all who identify with Jesus. So folks have pulled at that, and we could talk about the same thing with the Spirit. When 1 John talks about the Spirit in chapter 4, it talks about the Spirit helping us to discern unfaithful or evil spirits in the world. It doesn't say the Spirit says that sanctions you to be totally sinless forever. It doesn't go in that direction. It goes in a different direction. So folks have picked away at those sorts of connections with the gospel, and Brown's claims of interpretation of the gospel is fundamental to these folks. And coming out of that then has been a shift in emphasis that 1, 2, and 3 are not necessarily glued together in this spectrum, in this continuity. And as Judith Liu argues, and she's, I think, one of the leading folks who have argued an alternative reading, and I found her work to be very helpful, that maybe we can think of these documents as kind of semi-autonomous rather than glued together. I say semi because, they do borrow or they do use some language that we have in the Gospels, and they do frame sort of life or human experience in terms of a binary. You're either with God or you're with the devil. So there is, and I'm not sure if it's her term or my term, but there is some family likeness here, but not necessarily dependence. And so she wants to read each of these documents as semi-autonomously independent, that they address their own circumstances, their own situations. There's some sort of family likeness, but they're not dependent on one another. They have their own things to say in each of the situations. And in doing so, they're not polemical writings attacking these big, bad, nasty people, but they're more pastoral documents concerned with the identity, the practices, the way of life of the folk they're addressing. Now, that's a long answer, long way around, and we can take little pieces of it.
That was fabulous.
It's a brilliant theory from Brown,
right.
But folks have set about deconstructing it, have set about saying, no, there are some very different ways of thinking about these documents.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that Brown does is what many of us want to do. We get these letters that don't have a lot of context to them. And what you want to do is to be able to read the words in light of a context. That's how we communicate. We know what the situation is. And I would note that even your own work on the Roman Empire is trying to help establish some context for reading the Gospels and other pieces. But understanding that broader context means that there are other things that we can take into account rather than some of this mirror reading that you refer to, where you find some words and then you create a situation that makes sense of those words. And your use of rhetoric, which is a common reality in the Greco-Roman world. There are various kinds of rhetoric, and rhetoric uses the language of insider and outsider to its own purposes sometimes, without necessarily referring to a specific context. So you talk about 1st, 2nd, 3rd John as epidectic rhetoric. What kind of rhetoric is that? It's a technical term. So unpack for us what epidectic rhetoric does and how might it use some of this insider-outsider kind of language.
Yeah. So this is the alternative to Brown's polemic, to think about the language and the way that the documents are written for a different purpose and in a different way. Now, this crazy word, epidectic or epidectic, I've heard it pronounced in various ways, so take your choice. At the heart of this Greek word is a verb, which those of us who have done our Greek know, the verb deiknoumi. It's one of those dreadful me verbs. And it means to show or to exhibit. So Aristotle argued that there were basically three big categories of rhetoric. There was deliberative rhetoric, which was about persuading folks, although I think all rhetoric tries to persuade in the end, but persuasion was particularly to the fore. Judicial rhetoric, which was about legal arguments, and epidectic rhetoric, which in simplistic terms is often called praise and blame rhetoric. You praise and you blame. And in doing so, you're actually very interested in constructing identities for groups or for cities, for communities. And so in this rhetoric, you commend certain things, you exhort certain things, you emphasize certain things, characteristics, behaviors, etc. And at the same time, you vilify. You beat up on folks or opponents, real or imaginary, who do the opposite, as a way, so the praise and blame, as a way of making your argument. So one of the folks who writes about rhetoric in the ancient world, a guy by the name of Menander, elaborates this, I think, really helpfully in terms of, so how is this identity work being done? And Menander says it's being done in three ways. First of all, to constitute a group, to affirm its identity, to secure its identity, you need origin. You need an origin story. Where did you come from? Who are you? Did you have a very famous ancestor? And you can think of various ways in the ancient world, people like Aeneas, for example, in Virgil's epic poem, the great ancestor. Or you can constitute origin in other ways, which is exactly what 1st John does. 1st John appeals to the beginning 8 times in this document. It's only 5 chapters. 8 times it refers to the beginning. which I think means when they first received the gospel and believed and committed to the gospel. That's their beginning. But also, 6 times the document says that they have been born of God. Which is kind of a nice maternal image for God when you think about it. So they're not just any old group, they're not any old group who enjoys each other's company and has a nice meal together occasionally, and they get along and they tell happy stories and all the rest of it. No, this is God's work. God has brought them into being. They are born of God. The dominant image for God in First John is God as Father. God has given them life. God has brought them into being. So the document stresses their origin as a fundamental part of their identity. The second thing that Méndez says is that a group tends to its organization, its constitution, its rules, its laws, those sorts of things. And so across these documents, we have whoever this we group is in First John. They're pretty authoritative. They're setting it out. Whoever they are. In 2 John, we have a character called the elder, no name. We don't even know if this is just an old man who's sounding off, because old men are allowed to do that, or whether this is some sort of recognized church office. He's got some sort of authority and he's an overseer in some way. We just don't know. 3 John also comes from an elder. And again, someone who exerts authority. We don't know if it's the same elder as 2 John. Personally, I doubt it because he says some different things. But he also exercises authority. So we've got some leadership folks exercising authority. But we also have this big commandment running through about loving the brothers and the sisters. And this is really important for kind of the community's self-discernment. You could almost talk about self-policing, I think. This is the big measure, that we love one another, we love the brothers and the sisters in very practical ways. So that's part of the governance or the setup of the community. And then the third feature, we've got origins, we've got governance, and the third feature that Méndez says about the identity of a group are its practices, its behaviors, its deeds, its actions. Obviously, love is a key one. Love for one another, love for God. Faithfulness in the teaching is another one as well. Doing justice, doing charity, doing that sort of practical care, at least for one another. Now, whether it stretches beyond that insider boundary to outsiders is another question. And I don't think the document's clear about that. So there are these practices, all of which constitute the insider group. But of course, we've got references to these antichrists. We've got references to the liars, the false prophets, the deceivers. And so here's a way of establishing the insider-outsider boundary. Some folk, are these actual folks? Some folks have said, yes, they are. Some folks have said, well, no, actually, they're functioning in the rhetoric as a way of making the boundary very clear. I don't know about that. I don't know that we've got enough evidence to decide that one. But in theory about how groups constitute their social identity, and there's a whole bunch of theory around social identity work. Clearly, origins and governance and actions are all part of that. But there's a part of the theory is the notion of what's called a prototype, that groups can have a prototype of somebody who exhibits the right sort of behavior, who's a model that you can look up to. In 2 John, the elder addresses Gaius. He really likes Gaius. He really likes Gaius. 2 John, he really likes the elect lady as well, because these are models of particular virtues. In 3 John, he really does not like Diotrephes. Diotrephes does not play his game and does not respect the authority of the elder. He gets a real ticking off. So these are prototypes, positive or negative in terms of identifying that boundary between insiders. This is who we are. This is how we live. This is what it means to abide in God and Jesus. This is what it means to affirm that Jesus has come in the flesh. This is how we live, unlike those folks who don't do these sorts of things. So instead of sort of being a polemic primarily, this alternative way is to read these documents as doing basically pastoral work in affirming the identity and the way of life of what it means to be followers of Jesus, to abide in God, to abide in Jesus. So it's a very different way of constructing the rhetoric around identity formation, around faithfulness and truthfulness and those sorts of things.
That's a great segue, I think, to our next topic, Warren. If we look at just First John, it's called a letter. I'm good at asking a lot of questions at once, Warren, as you probably ascertained already. Is it a letter? It doesn't seem to be.
Yeah.
If not, what is it? And then, if you look at Brown, you have a great explanation in your book in terms of, the approaches to how it's structured, right? That you have Brown, you have Martin, and you have Painter, who have, broad brushstrokes of, a couple sections, breaks into this section and this section and this section. That's it. But it really, and you argue this, and Judith Liu, as you alluded to, she does as well, that it's really little micro sections, if you may, that address different topics of, abiding and truth. And there's connections between these, but they all are their own micro units in a way. Can you explain, your approach from is it a letter? What is it? If not, and then how's it structured?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question because, if it walks like a letter and quacks like a letter, is it a letter? Well, we don't have any of that letter address at the beginning. If you look at 2nd John and 3rd John, we've got the standard way of introducing a letter, the sort of stuff we have from Paul, for example. In the ancient world, you identified yourself as the writer, the elder, then you would identify to whom you're writing the thing, the addressees, to the elect lady, to the beloved Gaius. You identify in that way. We don't get that. And then usually, grace and peace or some sort of greeting like that. And standard letters across the ancient world, I hope you are in good health. We still do this same sort of stuff in emails today. I mean, we don't say, I hope you're miserable and you're suffering greatly, We don't do that. We may not exactly use grace and peace every time, but often there's sort of an attempt at some sort of social connection. But we don't have that in 1 John. We go straight into this. We have beheld, etc., etc., and we're going to tell you about it. Did the first couple of verses get lost somewhere along the line? That's an interesting theory, but an argument from silence. But then, through the whole document, we also get a lot of this you language. So we get that second person address, the sort of stuff you'd find in a letter as well. So I don't think it is a letter. It's certainly not as 2nd and 3rd John are letters, but it is direct address to the recipients. It's not just sort of some obtuse reflections on the following themes. Some folks have wondered about, is it a sermon? Is it a homily? I don't think it is, but it's kind of got some sermonic touches in it. So that's why I come back to this epidactic rhetoric thing, because I think it's doing those sorts of identity affirming and constructing way of life, reinforcing that sort of work. And I don't know that I really have a very clear genre that I can happily stuff it into. We've got some features, but we've got this rhetoric. And as you say, Patrick, this question of how's it organized then has really intrigued folks. And, you can read for days about the different constructions and theories and the big themes and how they cycle around, and then they get deeper and deeper. So you've got the whirling tornado effect of it sort of intensifying as it goes through, and nothing has persuaded. And I think what Dwayne Watson does in terms of focusing on some of the techniques of the rhetoric, and what Judith Liu does in terms of looking at these little fragments, a couple of verses, and they get connected by a key word or a key phrase or a theme or something like that. And I think that's very hard to diagram, and it's very hard to write a book on these nice little fragments. It's so much easier to do it in chapters or sections. But I think it's more, in a sense, honest. It's more faithful to the nature of the construction, so that these things are linked together by key words. The point is developed by key words rather than saying first and second and third and fourth. It sort of grows organically through the repetition of words. There's a lot of repetition in this document. Repetition and antithesis and development and heaping up of synonyms, those sorts of things through the document.
Yeah, and some of this, the development that you're talking about, and some of the swirling language as one way to structure this, it's not until we're quite a ways into First John that we get some of this very antithetical language, these antichrists and those who went out from us. Whereas you would assume that would show up earlier if that was the real problem.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So it's showing up kind of late in the letter in terms of its development. Say a little bit more, you've already touched on this, but say a little bit more about how these negative examples help shape identity.
Yeah.
Why do we need the negative examples along with the positive things?
What I think is happening, and I think there are two ways of thinking about this, is this sort of a shadow of and alluding to what has happened with the we group. As you have heard, they went out. And so the we group can keep, or the writer or writers can keep evoking this terrible experience that they had, not that the community had, but kind of as a lesson for the community. If you don't pay attention to how you talk about Jesus, if you don't pay attention to the reality of sin in your midst, even as you try not to sin, if you don't pay attention to thinking carefully about what the Spirit is or is not doing in your midst and what you can and can't claim for the Spirit, then you're going to get into these same sorts of problems that we experienced. And I think, that's one way of thinking about it, that there's sort of this historical evoking of this experience as a way of teaching, as a way of informing, alerting, warning the folks. And so they become, these negative prototypes. If you don't pay attention to it, then you become liars. You're not true to the material. You're false. You become deceivers. You deceive yourself and you deceive others. If you don't affirm that Jesus is the Christ, then you're an antichrist. Notice, by the way, that term is plural, so you can't just use it as a singular favorite politician that you like to hate. I mean, you just can't do that. It actually refers to a group, at least two of these antichrists. So in one sense, if we take them as actual historical figures and referring to an actual historical event that at least that we experience, then they become models in that sense of an antithesis. The other way of doing it is to say, well, we don't even know if there's an actual schism that anybody experienced. And is this all a rhetorical trope? Is this all a rhetorical strategy? Lots of New Testament writings talk about false teachers and alert people to. Matthew does it, Mark does it, Paul does it, 1st and 2nd Timothy does it, 2nd Peter does it, Jude does it. It's all through these documents. So is it a rhetorical trope to evoke imaginary figures, but to make the point? And it's the same point, we just, I think, get there by a different route. To make the point of, this is what happens if you don't pay attention carefully to these things. You become antichrists and liars and all the rest of it. You end up in the same point, I think, rhetorically, securing this division of insiders and outsiders. But you get there either by actually evoking a real set of folks or constructing them, using them as a rhetorical trope. Jokes do this all the time. A priest went into a bar and such happened. Well, which priest? Well, we don't need to know if it was an actual priest or a rhetorical priest, right? I mean, it can be made up. It makes the point, whatever. Rhetoric does it all the time as well. So, but it secures the insiders and the outsiders. It emphasizes who the insiders are supposed to be, how they're supposed to live. And it makes this big beware warning. Be careful. You're not messing with nothing here. You're messing with something very important. And it's important that you take the understanding of it, the articulation of it, the living it out seriously. You don't want to end up in this mess.
Right. And epidectic rhetoric uses both praise and blame in the process of praising. You need that contrast,
right,
in order to draw it out.
Yeah, it helps to secure what's being praised in the division. Yeah. So they act as foils. So that would be another way of saying it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Warren, your subtitle in the book, which I don't think I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, talks about deconstructing construction. So, the deconstructing the construction of this community through the work of Brown and others, Painter, Martin, and so forth, sort of as an untangling of these 4 documents. So, in your view, how are they connected? Brown, I think, talks about 4 phases in the history of the community and how each one fits into that 4-fold sequence. If we untangle it, as you call it, deconstruct these constructions, what's left in terms of who is the author or authors of these documents, and how are these documents related to each other?
Yeah.
Or are they?
Yeah. Well, that's I think a really good question. I use this phrase very deliberately in the subtitle, very intentionally, because Brown's analysis has, and this would be unfair to say, he'd never claimed this, but it's almost risen to sort of scriptural authority in some interpretive circle. He would never claim that. I mean, but it's been given this sort of weight, as though it's the only way to read this material, and I wanted to underscore it is a construction. It is a way of making meaning, and it's made good meaning, and it's been very convincing for many for a long time. But it's not the only way of putting the pieces together, as we've talked, or in terms of your question, Patrick, of separating the pieces. So what holds them together? Well, I do think we have, as I said, some family likeness in terms of the language. I think there is some shared language from the gospel across the document. But there's also significant individuality. There are words that occur in the gospel that these documents don't use. These documents use language that doesn't occur in the gospels. And this has been known for a long time. I reference a commentary from about 1911, where this is set out in great detail. I mean, we've known this for a long time, but what conclusion to draw from it? So part of the deconstruction is that I don't think we have this nice, neat sequence of gospel and 1, 2, 3, all nicely tied together with a red ribbon and a bow. I don't think we have that. I don't think we have one author. We notice that neither the gospel nor 1, 2, and 3 John, nobody uses the name John on these documents. This is a name given to them subsequently. So we don't know who the we is for 1 John. And we don't know who this elder is for 2nd and 3rd John. As is it just some old man who's got some opinions here, or is it and which would be a very valid interpretation of the word elder, or is it somebody who has authority? So we just don't know. If we read it as someone with authority, then I think it's a pretty authoritative person. He's really saying nice things about the elect lady. He's a great fan of hers. And by the way, I think she's actually leader probably of a house church. I don't think she is a metaphorical character. I think she is a leader of a house church. And he's saying some very nice things. In 3rd John, whoever the elder is saying very nice things about Gaius. And suddenly Demetrius pops up near the end, and he's a good guy too, although we're not exactly sure why he's a good guy. And Diotrephes is a bad guy because he doesn't receive the teachers. I do think this elder in 2nd and 3rd John is a different character, because in 2nd John, the elder pretty much discourages the welcoming of itinerant teachers. He doesn't rule it out completely, but he says to the elect lady, you've got a good thing going there, so be very careful. Beware of these many who have gone out, these many who are wandering around. And he actually gives her a doctrinal test. Can they confess that Jesus has come in the flesh? So, exercise the test. But in 3rd John, whoever this elder is, pats Gaius on the back for receiving the itinerants and giving them hospitality, which I presume means accommodation, food, maybe even some money, etc. There's nothing there about a test. And likewise, Demetrius has done something good. But Diotrephes did not welcome them, did not receive them. And he gets blistered for being a bad boy. He exercised the caution, one might argue, that the elect lady exercised in 2 John. And he gets vilified. He likes to put himself first. So, of course, he doesn't want to share the limelight with anybody. So he rejected these itinerants, and those in his group who wanted to receive them, he tossed them out. This is real good vilification for doing what 2 John seemed to.
Right.
And here they are sitting side by side in the canon.
Right.
Make sense of that. So we don't know about these authors. Some folks have wanted to shuffle the pieces in another way, and I just don't know about this. So we've got 1 John, 2 John, 3 John in the canon. Some folks have wanted to reorder them. 2 John should come before 1 John, then 3 John. Other folks have said, no, let's start with 3 John and work backwards. 3 John, 2 John, 1 John. Whatever order you can arrange the numbers, folks have done. Now, as I say, I just don't know. I don't know how we decide that. I don't know that we have enough evidence. But it's another example of this. These things are not set in concrete. Folks can make arguments, interpretation, and deconstruct that order in different ways. And who knows, in the next 10 years, one of the reconstructions might become very definitive. I don't know. But I don't play that game in the book here. I mention it, but I don't play the game because it takes up far too much space.
Yeah. Well, you've anticipated some of our questions about the relationship of the gospel and epistles, and it didn't start with Brown, who tried to link them together and create this Johannine community behind it. People have long recognized the similar kind of rhetoric that is going on. And hence they end up with the name John attached to them, even though they don't use John anywhere.
Yeah. And so folks have often run with this. The early church made this connection. So which John is it? Is it John the Apostle? Who is this beloved disciple? Is it John the Elder? Or is it some other John that folks have tried to identify? And I understand that quest. We like some certainty. But I think at the heart of it is what I would think of as a misdirected quest. It's as though if we could nail this down, if we could actually persuade ourselves that this is John the Apostle, if we could actually get his authority on these things, it would somehow make them more authoritative or more true or more faithful. And that's often what's at stake in some of this questing. That's often the implication, sometimes unspoken. And I would rather simply more cautiously say we don't know. And that doesn't deplete their authority. It doesn't diminish their authority. It doesn't say we ought to throw them out of the canon because we don't know. It simply says we don't know on that matter who these writers are, which puts our attention then back on the writings themselves. And the claims that they're making and the teaching that they're giving and the identity work that they're doing. And so we don't get distracted. Now, I'm not saying that if we can work out who writes these documents, then, okay, work it out. But it's true across much of the New Testament. The names on the Gospels don't get added until late in the 2nd century. And so there's no point saying Matthew the Apostle must have written this because it's got Matthew's name on it. That doesn't follow at all. And it's just better to say when we don't know than to make something which is essentially a doctrinal statement rather than a historical statement.
Yeah. Warren, one aspect that strikes me when I read through your book was this concept of hospitality. You have it's described. You have hospitality, a bit different in 2 John versus 3 John, obviously. How is hospitality found in 1 John? Is it present there as well? I think your answer is yeah, probably. But then we look at across the New Testament, early Christian writings, the DDK as well, even outside the New Testament. Do we have a definitive statement when it comes to this is what hospitality looks like in early Christianity, or we have different views and aspects of hospitality, probably context driven, I suspect. Maybe there's a doctoral dissertation in that, I suspect. I don't know.
Yeah, well, a number of folks have written on this topic, and I think question's a really good one, because it would be easy to assume that hospitality just means welcome everybody. Well, not according to 2 John, right? And not according to Diotrephes. And even in 1 John, if you see your brother or sister in need, and you have the world's goods and you do nothing, shame on you. That's my paraphrase. So what are there boundaries to hospitality in 1st and 2nd John? Are there some folks for whom hospitality should be extended, but folks for whom it should not be extended? I don't know that we've got enough information to make that a clear answer to that. But certainly we've got a leaning to insiders more than outsiders. I think that's a fair nuance. Across, if we go to Matthew's Gospel, when do we see you hungry or thirsty or without clothing in need, etc.? It's pretty much an open book. And if we think about that gospel in relation to any old city in the Roman Empire, I particularly think Antioch, but it doesn't have to be Antioch, and we know from, and I refer to this in this book, we know from sort of demographics of the Roman Empire that we've got a very hierarchical world, we've got a very privileged elite, and then we've got 85% of the population that we would have to call poor, and gradations of poverty. Some folks who do subsistence, above subsistence for part of a year, but then cycle under it. Other folks who live around subsistence, and other folks who are just dropping out the bottom because they can't even get to subsistence. There's a massive market, so to speak, there for hospitality. Who's got the resources? So I think it's a really tricky question, and one that requires some nuancing. And I kind of like the 2 John caution about this. I think it's very easy in a sermon to say, we have to extend love and hospitality to everybody. Well, some unknown folks could be dangerous, maybe. Is that what we mean? Do we mean we should put ourselves in danger at every point? I mean, I think that's the sort of stuff we have to think about rather than just sort of make a blanket statement. If these opponents in 1 John, if they are some actual real people, and one of these liars or antichrists turns up to your little house church gathering and says, I want to be part of your community. I think everything you believe is wrong and everything I believe is right, but I'm going to be here because you have to show love to brothers and sisters. What are you supposed to do? So I don't think this is an easy question at all, but I think it's one that the documents very helpfully put on the agenda.
Well, our focus has long been on the if you confess Jesus has come in the flesh, that kind of propositional statement.
Yes.
And we've overshadowed any real reflection on hospitality and the benefits and the dangers that this involve.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
And this is really ripe for a lot more reflection. I just did a Bible study last night on Jude, where some of this seems to be happening there as well. There are these people in your midst that are actually causing a lot of division. And so there's a potential danger within the community as well. So the letters seem to invite us to reflect a little bit more. But here's my question in all of that. There's in the first century and second century, there are a lot of itinerant teachers running around. Not only Christian teachers, as we see from some of Paul's writings, but other people who make a living off of going from town to town teaching. How does that practice, which we don't experience in our own day, we go to teachers, how would hospitality work in a culture where people went from town to town teaching like that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good context for it. And if we think about, say, 2 Corinthians, where we've got exactly this problem, Some folks have turned up, have become, seems taken over leadership, have discredited Paul, and Paul is not happy. So he talks about some criteria that an itinerant teacher, philosophical or religious teacher, some criteria that they ought to demonstrate. Do they have letters of commendation? That's one of them. What sort of experience do they have if they're going to be a religious teacher? What sort of experience do they have in the material that they're teaching? If you're going to talk about mystical experiences, what sort of mystical experiences have they had? Paul says, "Well, I've made it to the third heaven." So what sort of experience? Do they ask for money? And an itinerant teacher should ask for money. And of course, Paul has a problem there because he didn't ask for money. So there are some tests that any itinerant teacher needs to be able to verify. What disciples do you have elsewhere? What followers have you made elsewhere that can vouch for you? This sort of stuff. And the Didache takes this up in terms of within the Jesus movement. And the big test in the Didache, they've got to teach some conventional things, but of course we don't have one conventional thing yet. From the very beginning, we have lots of diversity from the very beginning. So the big test is, do they stay for more than 3 days and ask for money? And those are both negatives in the Didache. You don't stay for more than 3 days and you don't ask for money. So that's an attempt to try to help this sort of situation, just as 2 John here says, we've got a doctrinal test, Jesus come in the flesh. But 3 John doesn't seem to go there at all. How do you know? So I think, this is a big problem. And someone turns up and says, I've got a word from the Lord and I want to talk to your community. Well, if you're a leader, how do you discern this? You can discern it with 20/20 hindsight, but, the danger is done. So, this is a really big one. And I think 2 John might be a little more helpful in this regard than 3 John, except for the negative example of Diotrephes, who was not persuaded by sort of an open door policy.
So we're about out of time, but I'd be remiss without asking this question. We have a lot of pastors, ministers, folks who teach classes at church on a regular basis. Greg just mentioned he just finished up teaching a series on Johannine Epistles. How should one approach the Johannine Epistles if you're preaching them, if you're teaching them? Do you have any great recommendations for our audience? And then at the same time, I suspect Judith's commentary is a great piece to pick up in addition to your book in terms of having a companion along your journey of preaching and teaching it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of a basic approach, I think it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of the Brown construction. And I know folks who have taught this, and it's interesting, it's intriguing, etc. But I think in terms of ministry, whether it's preaching or teaching, what I would want to do is come at it in terms of what's the rhetoric doing? What are these documents? How are they functioning for believing communities? And so I would want to be talking about identity. I'd want to be talking about practices coming out of that model of identity formation and the rhetoric, the epidactic rhetoric. I don't think these documents are going to give us great doctrinal mileage. There's a bit of doctrine there, but it's not Romans. But I don't think that makes it lesser, because rather than asking the question, Christian, what do you believe? I think they ask the question, Christian, how do you live? And I think that's a very different question, and I think it's often a difficult question for some of us to answer truthfully in a way that might impact how we actually live. And I'm not being all judgmental about that. I'm talking about we language in that statement. So I think it puts that emphasis on lived faithfulness, on it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And of course, our world is not the first century world. There are a host of questions around that issue in our own society that we can explore in relation to how do we think about and what do we do about all sorts of issues in our world. Every time I read the figure that 25% of folks in this country are food insecure. How is that possible? How is it possible in a country that can spend billions blowing up other countries and we can't even feed ourselves? And I know lots of churches are at work in that area, and God bless them, but there's more to be done. And that's just one little piece. Lots and lots and lots of those sorts of pieces that would take us well beyond First, Second, and Third John. They're not issues that First, Second, and Third John mention specifically, but they point us toward how do we live, what is our way of life, and what difference does being a follower of Jesus make beyond making a confession? What's the so what the confession? And so I think in that regard, and I think they're very relevant in our society and in our culture. So if I was doing that, if I was doing a series, for example, either preaching or teaching, then that's the way I would come at it, in terms of what's the rhetoric doing, rather than getting lost in the weeds. What sort of people do they construct us to be, and how we live? In terms of resources, Patrick, I think Judith Liu's writings, have been really, really helpful in terms of sort of lining this out. I don't think, I've got to be careful about saying that, I'm not sure if Dwayne Watson has written an analysis of a book on the Johannine material. I know he's done a bunch of scholarly articles, but I'm not sure about a book. If he's done a book, that would be really helpful into thinking about how the rhetoric is functioning across the writings. I'm just not sure about that. I'm sorry.
Right.
I'm
not either. I know his articles are quite helpful, but I don't know if he's put it into a book. He should.
So. Yeah. And for our audience, I think that really want to push that they should get your book. It is a very easy to follow piece. The arguments are laid out very succinctly. I would feel comfortable using this with undergraduates, lay people who have never really followed much in terms of technical scholarship. It's just very clear. Your skill as a writer, but breaking down the complexities of some of the prior arguments are really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's very much the audience for it. And, if you have a group that likes to read, then you can easily read chapter by chapter, or even not necessarily all of them if you don't want to do all of them, but across 6 or 7 weeks or something like that, read a chapter and talk about it together and its implications. So I think for church groups, it's very accessible. Yeah,
I concur. Warren, anything fun on the horizon from an academic standpoint? What are you working on now?
Always things on for fun. So I've just published a couple of books. One on a co-written book on the New Testament and early Judaism, which has the subtitle of I have to think about what the subtitle is. I always get it wrong. Troubling Misunderstandings. That's its subtitle. Troubling Misunderstandings. And so it's a co-written book. I wrote it with Ariel Feldman, who's a scholar of early Judaism. And we look at some of the troubling things that Christian folks say about early Judaism, and then set about trying to correct some of those troubling things. And again, it's written for church groups, for classrooms, so it's very accessible. And then the other thing that I've just published is a 2-volume commentary on Matthew. It's big.
Right, I saw it come out during SBL. I would like to purchase it.
But it's been in the making for a while, and I'm really pleased that it's finally appeared. It's in this Illumination series, and one of the it's not just another commentary. One of the distinctive things about that series is that you have to write a history of interpretation essay for something related to each chapter through the gospel. Yeah, that was a lot of work. 28 chapters, 28 short essays on an aspect of, you can't write about the whole chapter. You can write books about pericopes, let alone a whole chapter. So that was really interesting to pick up aspects of some of this material and the way it's been interpreted across the ages and even in contemporary times. So I remember doing an essay around forgiveness material, and a lot of rethinking about forgiveness, especially in pastoral care literature. Is forgiveness automatic? Is it a right? Is it a demand? Is it always appropriate? Yeah. Pastoral care question. So anyway, that's that 2-volume commentary has finally appeared, and I'm very pleased about that. My current piece that I'm working on, which is really interesting, and again, this is by invitation, so it's not something I would have dared to do without, but a book on Rome and Judea. So the interactions between Roman power and Judean subjugation from Pompey, 63 BCE, when Roman rule was established, through to the second failed war for independence of Bar Kosovo in 135, and particularly tracking out the ways in which imperial power is asserted, plural, the ways, the strategies, and the ways, again, plural, strategies in which Judeans negotiate these assertions of Roman power. It's been really good to work on. There's a ton of good scholarship around these sorts of issues, and I mean, my little contribution to it is to particularly pick up the imperialized interactions. That's my little piece in it all. But it's been really, really fun to work on, and got a wee bit to do yet, but hopefully sometime in the next year or so.
We'll be watching for it. Warren, you're so darn prolific.
We've just incredible.
Yeah, we've interviewed Joel Green, and we had a conversation with Joshua Jipp, who was earlier on in his career than Joel and you are. But all of you published so many very, very useful books and articles that are quite helpful to the community, the church community.
Just means we could have him back on for more.
Yeah, sounds like a Matthew series is coming up.
Well, there are 28 chapters, so that'll take a while.
Well, Warren, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fascinating conversation and a wonderful start to our series on the Johannine Epistles. We appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for featuring the book. And good wishes as you continue to poke around in this. It's intriguing material, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is.
As you continue to work with it. So all good wishes for it. So thanks much.
For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.